Story disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction and is intended for entertainment purposes only. The content includes dark themes, horror elements, and fictional depictions of rituals and sacrifices that are purely imaginative and not reflective of any real-life practices or beliefs. Viewer discretion is advised. This video is not suitable for younger audiences, and parental guidance is recommended. The story does not endorse or promote any harmful behavior, violence, or dangerous activities. Please note that all characters, events, and settings are entirely fictional and created for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. Welcome to the gripping tale of what dark secret lurks behind the church walls. In the vibrant city of Yaoundé, Cameroon, young Pastor Fabrice opens the doors to a thriving church, bringing hope and light to his community. Known for his unwavering commitment to his congregation, he dedicates himself to serving the sick and uplifting the lost. But when a mysterious stranger offers him a deal that seems too good to be true, a piece of land for a mega church and a chance to secure his family's future, Fabrice is drawn into a web of dark secrets and sinister pacts. As he begins to build his new life, Fabrice discovers that the cost of his success may be more than he bargained for. The stranger reveals his true intentions, demanding a chilling alliance with a shadowy cult that thrives on fear and manipulation. With his faith tested and his community at stake, Fabrice must confront unimaginable horrors and uncover the truth behind the darkness that threatens to consume them all. Join us on this suspenseful journey filled with shocking twists, moral dilemmas, and the unbreakable bond of faith. Will Fabrice rise above the darkness, or will he fall prey to the sinister forces at play? The city of Yaoundé, Cameroon was alive with the sounds of people bustling through the streets. In a small corner of the town, a humble church stood. Pastor Fabrice, a young, kind-hearted man, had recently opened the doors of his church to the community. He was full of energy and devoted his life to helping others. Fabrice was committed to visiting the sick in hospitals and making house calls for those who couldn't make it to church. His sermons were simple, but his love for God and his people made him beloved by everyone. In just a few months, word about Fabrice's church spread. People loved the music that was played during the services, and it wasn't long before young people started flocking in. The pews were filled, and soon there wasn't enough space to hold the growing crowd. Fabrice's heart swelled with joy. Seeing so many people come together gave him a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't long before he decided to expand. A new, bigger church was built, and the once small congregation continued to grow. Fabrice loved his role as a pastor. He dedicated his life to serving the church and its people. He felt truly blessed. But one Monday morning, everything changed. It was early, and the church was quiet. As Fabrice entered the main hall, he noticed a man seated in one of the chairs. The man sat with his head down as if in prayer. Fabrice respected his privacy, quietly heading to his office to begin his work. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on his door. The same man stood at the entrance. His appearance was neat, but there was something unsettling about him. Nevertheless, Fabrice welcomed him in, assuming he had come for advice or prayer. The man sat down, eyes still cast downward, before speaking in a calm, almost emotionless voice. "I've come to offer you something, Pastor," he said, sliding a small folder across the desk. Fabrice, curious, opened it. Inside were the papers for a piece of land. The man explained that the land was close by, perfect for a larger church, a mega church. He also offered Fabrice a shop within the church compound where he could earn some money and not worry about feeding his young family. Fabrice was taken aback by the man's generosity. He felt it was a blessing, a reward for his hard work and dedication. After all, he had been praying for a way to continue his mission with a larger space. Without much hesitation, Fabrice accepted the offer, shaking the man's hand and even praying for him. 2 days later, the man returned with the deed of the land. Fabrice, trusting him fully, signed the papers, and they both went to the bank to complete the transfer. Everything seemed perfect. Within a few months, the mega church was built, just as promised. The man continued to attend the services, blending in as if he was a devoted follower of God. But little did Fabrice know, this was only the beginning of something much darker. Weeks passed, and the new mega church was thriving. The congregation had doubled in size, then every Sunday, the seats were filled with people eager to hear Fabrice's sermons. The young pastor couldn't be happier. He thanked God every day for the blessings that had come his way, especially the mysterious man who had gifted him the land. Everything felt like it was part of a divine plan. But one quiet morning, Fabrice was jolted awake by a knock on his door. It was unusual for anyone to come by his house so early. As he opened the door, he was met with a chilling sight. It was the same man. His face was calm, but there was something unsettling about the coldness in his eyes. "It's time, Pastor," the man said, his voice eerily calm. Fabrice blinked in confusion. "Time? For what?" The man stepped inside without an invitation, his gaze unwavering. "For our pact. The church, the land, it wasn't free. Now, you must fulfill your end of the deal." Fabrice felt a chill run down his spine. His heart pounded as he tried to make sense of the man's words. "Pact? What are you talking about?" The man's lips curled into a slow, twisted smile. "The church you now stand in was built on a foundation of promises. Dark promises. And it's time for you to repay your debt. I want you to recruit the young men in your congregation, each one will be initiated into the cult. They will perform tasks and rituals beyond your imagination." Fabrice's blood ran cold. "No. I don't understand. I never agreed to anything like this. I'm a man of God. I can't." The man cut him off sharply. "You signed the papers. You took the land. Now you must deliver. Or everything you have built will crumble." Fabrice's head spun, his thoughts racing. His mind flashed back to the day he signed the papers. He had never suspected anything dark or sinister. How could he have known? The man had seemed so genuine, so generous. "I won't do it," Fabrice said, his voice trembling but firm. The man's smile faded, and for the first time, his expression grew menacing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial filled with a thick, dark liquid. Fabrice felt his breath catch as the man slowly twisted the cap of the vial. "This is just a taste of what will happen if you refuse," the man said. He tilted the vial, and a single drop of the dark liquid splattered onto the floor. The moment it hit, the wooden boards began to sizzle and blacken as though they had been touched by fire. Fabrice stepped back, horrified by what he was seeing. The dark liquid was burning a hole straight through the floor, without any fire, without any heat. The man's eyes gleamed. "This is only the beginning. If you refuse, your church will fall apart, your congregation will scatter, and you will lose everything. The only way out is to do as I say." Fabrice felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He couldn't believe this was happening. How could something so holy turn into something so dark? His church, his mission, all of it was at stake. "You have until the end of the week to decide," the man said, turning to leave. "But remember, Pastor, once you're in, there's no turning back." As the door closed behind him, Fabrice collapsed into his chair, shaken to his core. He stared at the hole in the floor, his mind racing. The man wasn't asking for money or favors, he was asking for the souls of the young men in the church. A cult. Dark rituals. It was everything Fabrice stood against. But now he was trapped. For days, Fabrice wrestled with the weight of the man's demand. His once vibrant sermons now carried a heavy burden, and the joy he once found in serving his congregation seemed distant. Each time he stood at the pulpit, his eyes wandered to the young men seated among the worshippers, their faces full of hope and innocence. How could he possibly lead them into something so dark? The man's chilling words echoed in his mind: the church, the land, it wasn't free. Every time Fabrice closed his eyes, he saw that drop of liquid burning through the floor, a sign of something far worse lurking beneath the surface. By midweek, Fabrice had reached his breaking point. He knelt on the floor of his office, praying harder than he ever had before. His heart ached, and his faith felt tested like never before. Lord, what have I done? Show me a way out. I don't want to lead your people astray. Please, give me a sign. As if in answer, a knock came at the door. Fabrice froze, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, he feared it was the man returning to pressure him once more. But when he opened the door, it was a familiar face: Jonathan, a bright and devoted young man from the church. "Pastor, are you okay? You haven't seemed yourself lately," Jonathan said, concern etched on his face. Fabrice tried to force a smile. "I'm fine, Jonathan. Just a lot on my mind." Jonathan nodded, but his eyes lingered on Fabrice with suspicion. "If you ever need anything, Pastor, we are here for you." Fabrice closed the door after Jonathan left, his heart heavy. How could he betray the trust of someone like Jonathan? How could he betray his congregation? Yet, the pressure of the looming threat began to crush him. He felt like he was standing at the edge of an abyss, with no clear way forward. Later that night, as Fabrice was preparing for bed, the sound of his phone buzzing jolted him from his thoughts. It was a message from the man. "Tomorrow. Midnight. At the church." Fabrice felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Tomorrow. Midnight. Whatever the man had planned, it was clear that Fabrice couldn't avoid it any longer. That night, sleep eluded him. His mind raced with anxiety and fear. The air in the house felt thick, almost suffocating. And then, in the dead of night, Fabrice heard something that made his skin crawl, a soft whisper, barely audible, drifting through his bedroom. It was as though the shadows themselves were speaking. "Fabrice." The voice hissed. "It's time." He shot up from his bed, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was dark, and nothing seemed out of place, but the whisper continued, wrapping itself around him like cold mist. Fabrice stumbled out of bed and onto his knees, praying fervently for protection. But the whisper didn't stop. It grew louder, twisting through the room until it filled his ears with a chilling chant. It was in a language he couldn't understand, yet it felt ancient and powerful, as though it had been spoken by something not of this world. Fabrice scrambled to his feet and grabbed his Bible, holding it tightly to his chest. As he did, the chanting slowly faded, leaving the room in deafening silence. The cold air lingered, but the whispers were gone. Shaken, Fabrice stood in the dark for what felt like hours. He knew, without a doubt, that tomorrow's midnight meeting would be far more dangerous than he could have imagined. And yet, there was no turning back. The man had made that clear. With trembling hands, Fabrice sat at his desk and wrote a letter, just in case. He didn't know what the night would bring, but he wanted to leave behind a final word to his wife and child, should the worst happen. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Fabrice gathered his courage, knowing that his faith was the only shield he had left. He would face whatever waited for him at the church. But deep down, he feared he had already lost. The hours passed slowly, and as midnight approached, Fabrice felt the weight of dread pressing down on him. The church, usually a sanctuary of peace and light, had taken on a different aura. The shadows that crept along its walls seemed darker, more sinister. The stained glass windows, which once shimmered with soft hues of the divine, now cast eerie reflections on the ground as the moonlight poured through them. Fabrice stepped inside the church, his steps hesitant. The large hall, empty at this hour, echoed with his every movement. His breath felt shallow, his heart racing. The man had told him to meet at this time, but as he scanned the room, there was no sign of him. Maybe this is a test, Fabrice thought, trying to steady his nerves. Suddenly, the door at the far end of the hall creaked open. Fabrice's pulse quickened. Out of the darkness, the man emerged, his eyes gleaming like cold steel in the moonlight. He moved silently, as if his feet barely touched the ground. "You came," the man said with a cold smile. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. I'm here. "But I won't do what you've asked," Fabrice said, his voice trembling but determined. "This is God's house. I will not betray my faith." The man's smile faded, replaced by an expression of deep disappointment. "I see. You're still clinging to your beliefs. But let me show you something, Pastor." Without warning, the man extended his hand, and Fabrice watched in horror as the shadows around them began to move. At first, it was subtle, a flicker at the corner of his eye. But then, the darkness began to stretch and twist, like ink spreading through water. Fabrice stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. The shadows formed figures, tall, faceless beings that seemed to drift across the floor. They circled around Fabrice, their presence oppressive and suffocating. He could feel the weight of their gaze, though they had no eyes. The man stepped closer, his voice low and commanding. "These are the ones you've turned your back on. The ones who will ensure your failure if you don't accept what's coming." Fabrice tried to steady himself, holding his Bible tightly. "I won't be swayed. You can't force me to betray my congregation." The man's eyes narrowed, his smile returning, this time more sinister. "You think you have a choice? You've already taken the first step, Pastor. You accepted the land, the church. Now, you must fulfill the agreement, or everything you hold dear will be destroyed." As the man spoke, the shadowy figures drew closer. Their cold, dark forms began to brush against Fabrice, and he could feel a deep, icy chill seep into his bones. He clenched his teeth, refusing to show fear, but the darkness was consuming. "You see, Pastor, this isn't about you anymore. It's about them," the man said, gesturing toward the altar where Fabrice had preached so many times. "The young men who come to you for guidance. They are the ones who will join the cult. They will perform the rituals, whether you agree or not." Fabrice's heart sank. The thought of leading innocent young men into a world of darkness made him sick. "I'll protect them. I'll fight you." The man's laugh echoed through the church, cold and cruel. "Fight me? You can barely stand in the face of shadows, Pastor. What will you do when real power comes knocking?" At that moment, one of the shadowy figures lunged toward Fabrice. Instinctively, he raised his Bible, and as the book touched the dark form, a burst of light erupted. The shadow recoiled, hissing like a wild animal, before dissolving into the floor. Fabrice gasped, gripping his Bible tighter. It was a small victory, but he wasn't naive enough to think it was over. The man watched with mild amusement. "Oh, so there's a bit of fight in you after all. But this is just the beginning, Pastor. Your faith will be tested far beyond what you've seen here tonight." Before Fabrice could respond, the man turned to leave. "You have one more day to decide. Lead the young men into the fold, or the church, your entire life, will crumble before your eyes." As the man disappeared into the darkness, Fabrice fell to his knees, his body trembling. He had never felt so powerless, so trapped. He knew now that this was no ordinary challenge. The forces at play were darker than anything he could have imagined. But in his heart, he clung to one thing, his faith. He had seen the power of God's light when the shadow recoiled from the Bible. And he knew that as long as he had that light, there was still hope. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, Fabrice stood and began to pray, his voice shaking but filled with determination. He didn't know what would come next, but he was prepared to fight for his church, his congregation, and his soul. The following day, Fabrice awoke with a feeling of dread heavier than before. The church, the place he had once loved so deeply, now felt tainted by something far darker than he had ever imagined. As he went about his morning routine, the memory of the shadowy figures haunted him, their cold presence still lingering in his mind. But as noon approached, Fabrice knew he had to go back to the church. He had no choice. The man had promised to return, and with him, the terrifying ultimatum, lead the young men into darkness or face ruin. When Fabrice entered the church, it was eerily quiet. The air was thick with tension, as if the building itself was holding its breath. As he approached the pulpit, his eyes were drawn to something out of place, a large, wooden box, intricately carved, sitting right at the front of the altar. Fabrice frowned, his pulse quickening. He had never seen this box before. It wasn't here yesterday. Who had placed it here? Was it another one of the man's tricks? Curiosity and unease warred within him, but his hand moved toward the box of its own accord. He hesitated, his fingers trembling as they grazed the smooth wood. With a deep breath, Fabrice slowly opened the lid. Inside, something horrific awaited. The box contained a grotesque, twisted figure, a small animal, lifeless, its body contorted unnaturally as though it had suffered some unspeakable agony. Its fur was matted with something dark. Fabrice knew it wasn't human blood, but the sight of it made his stomach churn. Alongside it, strange symbols were etched into the wood, symbols that made his skin crawl as if they held some dark power of their own. Before he could comprehend what he was seeing, a low, guttural whisper filled the air. The sound seemed to seep from the very walls, growing louder and more intense, surrounding Fabrice. The voice was calling his name. Fabrice. His heart leapt into his throat. The whisper came from behind him, but when he spun around, there was no one there. His mind raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. The church was empty, or at least, it should have been. Fabrice. The voice called again, louder this time, echoing through the empty halls like the cry of something ancient and otherworldly. His breath caught as his eyes darted across the room, trying to find the source of the voice. His gaze landed on the box again, and to his horror, the once lifeless animal now moved, its limbs twitching unnaturally. In sheer panic, Fabrice slammed the lid of the box shut, but the whisper continued, more insistent, more demanding. Fabrice, you cannot run. The air around him grew colder, and the lights in the church flickered. The candles, which he had lit just moments before, were suddenly snuffed out, leaving the room bathed in dim moonlight. The atmosphere was oppressive, as though the church itself was alive, its walls closing in on him. And then, the shadows returned. They slid across the floor like liquid, gathering around the altar, forming shapes, dark, elongated figures that began to rise, taking form. These were not the same shadows he had seen before. These were larger, more menacing, their forms more defined. They had arms, legs, and towering heads that seemed to stretch impossibly high toward the ceiling. Their faceless forms turned toward him, and Fabrice felt their gaze, cold and piercing. The lead figure, slightly larger than the others, stepped forward. Its movements were slow and deliberate, each step sending a jolt of fear through Fabrice's body. Without warning, the figure reached out, extending a long, shadowy hand toward the altar. The box, which Fabrice had closed, flew open as if ripped by an invisible force. The dark liquid from the box began to spill out, pooling on the floor, and as it spread, the shadows grew bolder, feeding on whatever dark energy it contained. Fabrice stumbled backward, his back hitting the pulpit. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind screamed for him to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot, frozen in fear. The lead figure spoke, its voice deep and hollow. The pact has begun, Fabrice. You cannot escape what is owed. I didn't know, Fabrice stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't know what I was agreeing to. The figure tilted its head, as though considering him. Ignorance does not absolve you. The young men must come. They must serve, or your fate is sealed. A chilling silence followed those words, and then, in a move so quick Fabrice barely registered it, the figure vanished, along with the shadows, leaving the church in complete silence once again. Fabrice collapsed to the floor, his body trembling uncontrollably. The church was back to its normal state, the candles flickering again, the box now gone. But Fabrice knew this was only the beginning. The shadows had made their presence known, and their threat loomed larger than ever. His heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, a plan forming in his mind. He had to find a way to stop this, before it consumed everything he had ever loved. Fabrice stood in the middle of the church, his mind racing. The air felt thicker, suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in on him. The dark figure's words echoed in his head, the young men must come. His thoughts spiraled into panic. He couldn't do it. He couldn't lead the young men of his congregation into the arms of this dark cult. But if he didn't, what then? That evening, Fabrice sat at his desk, trying to calm his nerves when he heard footsteps approaching. His heart sank as the door creaked open, revealing the man in black. The same cold, unsettling aura accompanied him, filling the room with dread. You have a decision to make, Pastor, the man said, his voice smooth but dripping with menace. Fabrice's throat tightened. He clenched his fists beneath the table. I won't do it. I won't give them to you. The man's eyes darkened, his smile fading into something far more sinister. It's not your choice anymore. Before Fabrice could react, the man raised his hand, and an invisible force slammed into him. He was thrown against the wall, gasping for breath as something tightened around his chest, something he couldn't see. It felt as if invisible ropes were constricting his body, tightening with every breath he took. You signed the pact, the man hissed. You are bound by the unseen. Fabrice struggled, trying to break free, but the grip only tightened. His vision blurred as his heart pounded wildly in his chest. Just when he thought he couldn't bear it anymore, the pressure suddenly released, and he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. The man loomed over him, his eyes cold and emotionless. You will fulfill your end of the bargain, Pastor. Or the consequences will be unimaginable. Fabrice lay on the floor, shaking. The man turned and walked out, leaving Fabrice alone in the suffocating darkness. The following Sunday, Fabrice tried to compose himself as he delivered the sermon, but he could feel the weight of the man's threat hanging over him like a cloud. The church was packed with young men, full of energy and enthusiasm, their eyes bright with hope. Fabrice's stomach churned as he realized these were the souls the man wanted. After the service, Fabrice retreated to his office, locking the door behind him. His thoughts were chaotic. He had to find a way out, some way to break the pact. But how? The man seemed to hold all the power. Suddenly, a knock echoed through the door. Fabrice tensed. For a moment, he thought it was the man in black again, but when he opened the door, it was one of the young men from his congregation, a boy named Samuel. Pastor, can I talk to you for a moment? Fabrice nodded, motioning for Samuel to sit. The boy looked troubled, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I don't know how to say this, Samuel began, his voice low, but strange things have been happening. My friends, the other young men from the church, they've been seeing things. Dark things. Fabrice's heart sank. He knew exactly what Samuel was talking about. We've seen shadows, Samuel continued, his voice trembling. They follow us. I've had nightmares, terrible nightmares. Fabrice felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. The man's influence was already spreading. Please, Pastor, Samuel pleaded. We don't know what's happening. Can you help us? Fabrice clenched his fists under the desk. He couldn't let the cult take these boys. He couldn't. I'll help you, Samuel, Fabrice said, his voice firm despite the fear gnawing at him. I promise. That night, Fabrice lay awake in bed, unable to shake the images Samuel had described. Dark shadows. Nightmares. He feared what the man might do next. The pact was closing in on him, and he was running out of time. Around midnight, Fabrice heard a strange noise, an eerie whispering, like the rustling of wind, but far too close. He sat up, listening carefully. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it became clear it was coming from the church. Fabrice grabbed his coat and hurried out into the night. The church loomed before him, its silhouette cast against the pale moonlight. As he approached, he noticed something strange. Light flickered inside, but the doors were locked, and there was no one there. Taking a deep breath, Fabrice pushed the door open. Inside, the church was empty, but the air was heavy, charged with an energy that made Fabrice's skin crawl. And then he saw it, the altar. The box from earlier had returned, and this time, its contents were more disturbing than before. A small animal, its body covered in strange markings, as though it had been part of some ritual, lay at the center of the altar. Around it, dark symbols were drawn in thick, black liquid. Fabrice gagged, his mind reeling at the sight. As he stepped closer, the temperature in the room plummeted, and he could see his breath in the air. The shadows, those same terrifying shadows from before, began to gather once more, swirling around the altar, their movements more erratic, more frantic. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. Fabrice's heart raced as he stumbled backward, his eyes straining to see. He could feel them, the shadows, they were everywhere. The whispering grew louder, filling his ears, until it became a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the shadows vanished. But something was wrong. Fabrice's gaze fell on the altar once more. The animal was gone. In its place was something far more horrifying, an old, tattered book, its cover made of worn leather, with symbols etched into it that Fabrice couldn't begin to understand. His hands trembled as he reached for it, but before he could touch the book, the church doors slammed shut behind him. He was not alone. As the church doors slammed shut behind Fabrice. He is not alone, is the man in black back. Join us on our next episode to find out.